Shalom, shalom. It's Brother Yatazadak, Hero Israel. It's Galatians Chapter 6 breakdown. Giving all honor and glory to Yahweh Ba'ashim Yahushai. Let's get right into it. This book of Galatians, Chapter 6 and verse 1. And it reads, Salaki. Brethren, if a man be overtaken in a fault, ye which are spiritual, restore such an one in the spirit of meekness, considering thyself, lest thou also be tempted. Now let's go to 2 Corinthians chapter 2 and verse 7, just to get a precept on the on what verse 1 pertains to. 2 Corinthians chapter 2 and verse 7, and it reads, So that contrariwise ye ought rather to forgive him and comfort him, lest perhaps such a one should be swallowed up with overmuch sorrow. Verse 8, Wherefore I beseech you that you would confirm your love towards him. For to this end also did I write, that I might know the proof of you, whether ye be obedient in all things. Verse 10, To whom ye forgive anything, I forgive also. For if I forgave you anything, to whom I forgave it, for your sakes forgave I it in the person of Hamashiach. So now this is Paul speaking on the man in the congregation who took his father's wife and uncovered his father's nakedness. So verse 1 is essentially Paul speaking to this Galatians. If that anyone is overtaken in a fault, which is a transgression amongst their own people, he's saying, ye which are spiritual, restore such as one in the spirit of meekness. So now this is why in the previous chapter he had mentioned the works of the flesh, which are things like adultery, fornication, lasciviousness, and variance, and so on and so forth. Now, things like adultery pertain to things like covetousness, lust. All these things go hand in hand. So the example that I brought up in 2 Corinthians 2 and 7 was the fault that this that the man had in taking his father's wife. So now Paul is not speaking on that incident, but the point here is that he's telling these Galatians, look, if any of those in the congregation is overtaken in a fault, if you're spiritual, you're going to restore him in the spirit of meekness. And like it said, well, let's go to chapter 5, Galatians chapter 5. So all these things go hand in hand. Paul is not, throughout the whole letter, just bringing up random ideas and examples. All these things go hand in hand. Now let's go to Galatians chapter 5 and verse 19. This book Galatians chapter 5 and verse 19. Now the works of the flesh are manifest, which are these: adultery, fornication, uncleanliness, lasciviousness. So now adultery, that's a work of the flesh, which goes into covetousness, which goes into lust. All these things are mentioned in the law. This is why the law is good, the law is perfect, and very necessary. So now he also mentions Now that's the example I'm bringing out to manifest the works of the flesh, which are things that are contrary to what the law considers acceptable and righteous in the eyes of the Most High, as far as what is commanded to do, which is acceptable, and things that are commanded to abstain from, like adultery and things of that sort, which is also commanded in the law. But the works of the flesh are manifested in the things that the law tells you to avoid. Now, I may not say each and every single thing to avoid, but this is why you're walking in the spirit of the law. You let the spirit lead you, and you judge in spiritual things by spiritual things, like I mentioned in the previous video, because the law comes in that spirit, in the spirit of righteousness. And the righteousness of the law is the works of the flesh, being dead to the works of the flesh, which are things like adultery, witchcraft, variance, which all are commanded in the law to avoid. Even murderers, like it says in verse 21. Because when you hate your brother, you're considered a murderer. Because it doesn't take much for someone who hates their brother to go as far as murdering them. But the point is that all these things are commanded in the law, which says in Leviticus not to hold a grudge against the children of your people. So the point here is the works of the flesh being things that are considered in the law to be things that you are to avoid. So if you're walking in the spirit, you're walking in things in the spirit of the law and the spirit of righteousness, which is things that are acceptable, which is the law commands you what things are acceptable. And the law also tells you what to avoid. Things like not holding a grudge against your people, and so on and so forth. So that's walking in the spirit. And the lust of the flesh are these things that are commanded, which is Paul is mentioning here in verses 19 and on down. These are also things that are in the law, but these are things that are commanded to abstain from. This is why Paul says he's dead to the works of the flesh, and to put off the works of the flesh. It just doesn't have things to do with lust. It has things to do with things that are commanded in the law to abstain from and to avoid, like variance, hatefulness, things of that sort. Now, if you go down to verse 22, says, "But the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, long-suffering, gentleness, goodness, and faith." Now showing love to your people is correcting them, like it says in Leviticus chapter 19. You should not suffer sin upon your people. So this is what Paul is saying in chapter 6 and verse 1. Because, let's go to it. Brethren, if a man be overtaken in a fault, ye which are spiritual, restore such a one in the spirit of meekness, considering thyself, lest thou also be tempted. So Paul is telling these Galatians, if one is overtaken in a fault, if you're spiritual, you're going to reprove him, and you're going to restore him, and through the Spirit. And if you're walking through the spiritual things that the law, the spirit that the law comes in, which is reproving your people, correcting them, And also, those are part of the fruits of the Spirit, showing love to your people. So you're supposed to restore them according to what the law commands. That's walking in the Spirit, because you're executing the things in the law, and you're showing it through your conduct, and you're correcting. This is how you correct your people. So it just doesn't have anything to do with just saying, look, you effed up. Well, you have to correct them, and that's all in love, and that's the Spirit, the fruits of the Spirit. Now let's go down to verse 2. Bear ye one another's burdens, and so fulfill the law of Mashiach. Verse 3. For if a man think himself to be something when he is nothing, he deceiveth himself. Verse 4. But let every man prove his own work, and then shall he have rejoicing in himself alone, and not in another. Now let's go to 1 Corinthians for a precept. 1 Corinthians chapter 3 and 13. This book of 1 Corinthians chapter 3 and 13. And it reads, Every man's work shall be made manifest, for the day shall declare it, because it shall be revealed by fire, and the fire shall try every man's work of what sort it is. Verse 14. If any man's work abide which he hath built thereupon, he shall receive a reward. Verse 15. If any man's work shall be burnt, he shall suffer loss, but he himself shall be saved, yet so as by fire. Now this is here Paul is going into laboring for the word, and this is what he's telling these Corinthians. Now what he's explaining here, and how it pertains to Galatians, verse 4, chapter 6. Now, this has to do with diligence, and this is how he's building up these various congregations. He's telling them, look, if your diligence is ultimately going to improve your own work, and that's all done through the power and spirit of Yahweh Shemel Shai. Because the Most High neither tempts man, and neither can he be tempted by evil. Shortly paraphrasing. Actually, let me see if I can get that preset. Slack it. Slack it, bear with me. See if I can find the one in Peter. Slack, y'all, just go to James. That's the one I'm looking for. It's book of James, chapter 1 and verse 13. And it reads, Let no man say when he is tempted, I am tempted of God. For God cannot be tempted with evil, neither tempteth he any man. So again, Paul's explaining to these various congregations that ultimately your own work is going to be proved whether you remain diligent. Because again, the point here is that even Yahweh Shai Mashiach, when he came on the scene and what he was doing to the rulers of the multitudes of the Jews, those that were in these high positions, he ultimately proved their work to be unfruitful. This is why he said, I will give the vineyard unto others. But Lord willing, I'll save that for another lesson. But ultimately, the Most High, He's going to prove your faith ultimately, and all these things pertain to your works. This is the main theme in Paul's epistles. The fact that faith and your works go hand in hand. So Ephesians chapter 6 and verse 4. Salakia, let's go back there real quick. Salakia, Galatians chapter 6 and verse 4. But every man shall prove his own work, and then he shall have rejoicing in himself alone, and not in another. Verse 5, for every man shall bear his own burden. So every man's going to bear his own burden, whether he'll be found diligent and faithful. And this is why, like I said, Yahweh Shai Mashiach did not find those of the rulers of the multitudes of the Jews, those that were in the high positions. He ultimately found them unfaithful, but yet he did not cast them away, but called this is why these things had to happen, because he had a call onto the Gentiles, these Israelite foreigners, in his ministry when he is telling the lost sheep to return back into the fold. Now let's go to a 2 Corinthians chapter 5 and verse 10. And it reads, for we must all appear before the judgment seat of Mashiach, that every one may receive the things done in his body according to that he hath done, whether it be good or bad. Verse 11, knowing therefore the terror of the Lord, we persuade men, but we are made manifest unto God, and I trust also are made manifest in your consciousness. So now, like it says in the scriptures and throughout the scriptures, Most High is going to try your faith, whether you're found worthy and diligent, and whether your works are acceptable. This is why it's important to study not just the scriptures, but going into etymologies, and also getting the right chain of events as far as things that transpired in the epistles and how to connect them to the events that pertain to the teachings of Yahweh Shai Mashiach and the things contained in the Gospels. So now let's go to the book of Romans chapter 2 and verse 6. And you got to understand that the things written, there are things that pertain to the time that these epistles were written. Not everything you are to take as literal. For example, I'll touch on it towards the end of the video, but as to when Paul mentions the Israel of God, that's actually Paul using the fact that Israel as a nation belongs to God. So not just what these Jews thought, that just because they were keeping the law that they were still in the covenants, and those who had went off and left and followed these heathen practices, that they were cast away. But let's move on to the book of Romans chapter 2 and verse 6. Or I'll start at verse 5. But after thy hardness and impenitent heart, treasurest up unto thyself wrath against the day of wrath, and revelation of the righteous judgment of God. Verse 6. Who will render to every man according to his deeds. Now verse 5, this here Paul is alluding to the wrath and the destruction coming to Jerusalem during the siege of 70 AD. Now the same things are being played out today. We know there's a destruction coming to the land, so we are warning our people and also building them up at the same time through these through the various teachers, through the brothers who make exhortation videos, and each one pertaining to his own office and to his own calling wherein he was called. See if I can get that precept real quick. Salakia. This book of Romans chapter 12 and verse 6. Or I'll start at verse 5. Verse 4. For as we have many members in one body, and all members have not the same office, so we being many are one body in Hamashiach, and every one members one of another. Having then gifts differing according to the grace that is given to us, whether prophecy, let us prophesy according to the proportion of faith, or ministry, let us wait on our ministry, or he that teacheth on teaching. Verse 8, or he that exhorteth on exhortation. He that giveth, let him do it with simplicity. So he that giveth also pertains to alms, but also the things that you may give to your other fellow believers. You can also do that in simplicity. It could just be a simple gesture. He that ruleth with diligence, he that sheweth mercy with cheerfulness. So now that's also going into showing that love to your people, because you're building them up because you love them, and you love them by building them up. You see that? Now let's go back to the book of Galatians chapter 6 and verse 6. And it reads, let him that is taught in the word communicate unto him that teacheth in all good things. So you see how that pertains to the precept I brought out. Because you can communicate through whether you're teaching, whether you're making exhortation videos, whether you're showing through your conduct. Now all these things are done as a body, and each ministration is it pertains to what the Most High has given you as an office. And all these things work for the edification of the nation of Israel, so-called Black, Hispanic, Native Americans, and that's all done through the power of Spirit of Yahweh Bashim Yahushai. Verse 7, be not deceived, God is not mocked. For whatsoever a man soweth, that he shall also reap. Verse 8, for he that soweth to his flesh shall of the flesh reap corruption, but he that soweth to the Spirit shall of the Spirit reap life everlasting. So now Paul is revisiting the theme that he touched on in chapter 5, the works of the flesh being adultery, fornication, murder, strife, seditions, which are things that are contained in the law as things to avoid. An example, do not covet, which goes into lust. And another example is not having a grudge against children of your people. And that goes into murder, because if you hate somebody, then you can go as far as murdering them. But the point here is that the works of the flesh, he that sows these type of things, meaning if you're walking and doing these things in your conduct and in the things that you do, that's what Paul means by sowing to the flesh the corruption. When you sow corruption, you're making these things manifest through your actions. This is why walking in the Spirit means walking in the Spirit that the Spirit of the law that the law comes in. So that the Spirit that the law comes in is righteousness. That righteousness is manifest through the things that are commanded, that are acceptable, like honoring your father, honoring your mother, loving your own people. And that's a spirit ultimately of righteousness, because like it says in Revelations, the spirit of prophecy is Yahweh Shai Mashiach, and the prophets were sent to reprove the children of Israel, and also to bear the good news of the things to come. So now this is why Paul is saying, he that soweth of his flesh, being the works of the flesh, shall reap that same thing. Now those are the spirits of the flesh. Salakia, that's the works of the flesh. And sowing in the Spirit are the things as far as the Spirit that the law comes in. This is why Paul says, I walk in the Spirit and not fulfill the lust of the flesh, because all these things pertain to what's commanded in the law. It's the book of Galatians Chapter 5 and verse 16. And it reads, this I say then, walk in the Spirit, and you shall not fulfill the lust of the flesh. So walking in the Spirit is walking in the things that the law commands you to do, which is righteous and acceptable in the eyes of the Most High. And not fulfilling the lust of the flesh, those are the works of the flesh that are manifest in what the law commands you to avoid. Things like adultery, covetousness. This is why the law is good. And let me get a precept on that. Salakia. Just make sure I get the right. I believe it's chapter 8. Salakia, bear with me. Book of Romans chapter 7 and verse 22. For I delight in the law of God after the inward man. And also he says in chapter 8 and verse 6. For to be carnally minded is death, but to be spiritually minded is life and peace. So again, the works of the flesh are manifest in the things that the law tells you to avoid. And to be spiritually minded is being at peace with your people, giving your people life. And ultimately, that's why he says in verse 10, and if a Mashiach be in you, the body is dead because of sin, but the spirit is life because of righteousness. Because again, you had these Jews in these higher positions over the multitudes of the Jews back in the time of the Romans and the Greeks. They were keeping the law, claiming to keep the law, but they weren't spiritually minded. Because when you're spiritually minded, it says in the law, do not covet. And also it says in the law not to hold a grudge against your own people, against the children of your people. But these men, they weren't spiritual because they did not discern the things that were contained in the law. Because they thought that one law overrided another, but this is why the law is perfect. Because if you're keeping the law, offering up sacrifice, and I'm speaking on things pertaining to back then, because we don't have a temple to do animal sacrificing right now. But the point is that these Jews, they were claiming to keep the law, but in the law, it's telling you to keep the feast days, to observe the new moons and the things like that they're Sabbaths. And also things like wearing fringes, and also as far as keeping the Sabbath. So they were keeping these things, but they were denying simple things like not holding a grudge against your people. Because if you're keeping all the physical works of the law, and by physical I mean things like the Sabbath, things of keeping the feast days, but they weren't being spiritual because they denied the whole point of the law was for the people to be in order and to be united as a collective. So they were denying the spiritual things, because at the end of the day, the Most High gave the law to the Israelites, not so they can, like these Jews were doing, clean their cups, give charity, and make themselves seem righteous. But the whole point was to have this government of people conduct themselves in a manner to where there is a division that is not being perpetrated. Nobody is perpetrating division or variance or hatred, but all things are done in a balance and in order. So now let's go back to Galatians chapter 5 and verse 8. Salakia 6 and verse 8. For he that soweth to his flesh shall of the flesh reap corruption, but he that soweth to the Spirit shall of the Spirit reap life everlasting. Now, we get this precept in 1 Corinthians chapter 15 and verse 50. So, bear with me. 1 Corinthians chapter 15 verse 50. And it reads, Now this I say, brethren, that flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom of God, neither doth corruption inherit incorruption. Now, that goes into, as far as, doing the things that are correct in the law that pertain to the spiritual things, which is like loving your own people. Because these Jews in the ruling positions under the Romans and the Greeks, they were corrupted. Now let's go back to Galatians chapter 6 and verse 9. And it reads, And let us not be weary in well doing, for in due season we shall reap if we faint not. Verse 10, As we have therefore opportunity, let us do good unto all men, especially unto them which are of the household of faith. Now, who is the household of faith? Because you have a lot of people that want to turn this verse and also verse 16 where it says Israel of God, they want to turn that into a whole doctrine, talking about this is people that are not of the nation of Israel, but this is what is speaking on the Gentiles, which they try to say it's everyone else. But that's not what it's speaking on, because that would go against the fundamental teachings of the law and the prophets. So who are the household of faith? Well, we have to go back to the previous chapters, mainly chapter 3, book of Galatians chapter 3 and verse 6. Even as Abraham believed God, and it was counted to him for righteousness. Know ye therefore that they which are of faith, the same are the children of Abraham. Now this is going into the promises that were given to Abraham, ultimately through the circumcision, and then commanded through the seed of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Jacob being Israel, through the 12 tribes of the nation Israel, so-called Black, Hispanic, and Native Americans. And those are the household of faith. And this is why you have to understand and separate the things that were written for back then. The reason why Paul wrote that those here in Galatians 6 and 10, Paul is saying to do good unto all men, especially unto them who are of the household of faith. What Paul is saying is doing good to all men, being to all Jews and Gentiles, which were these Israelite foreigners, especially unto them who are of the household of faith. He was saying especially to these Gentiles, because they are of that faith, the household of faith, because they were returning back into the fold through the Great Commission, through Yahushua, and calling the lost sheep of the house of Israel. So these Gentiles were coming back into the fold in these congregations, and they were justified by the faith and the promises that Abraham had before obeying the promises of the Most High and showing it through his works. and also they are of the household of faith because they are still of the lineage of Abraham. So they're returning through the faith that they can be obtain salvation through their belief in Yahweh Shai, and also in keeping of their former covenants. So Paul was saying to show good especially unto these of the household of faith. Why? Because these Israelite foreigners were coming back into the fold, and they needed to be built up more than anyone else. This is why Paul, throughout the epistles, constantly is feeding them the law, feeding them prophecies, speaking of the teachings of Yahweh Shai Mashiach. Now this is that love that he's showing, reproving, rebuking, like the man in Corinthians who took his father's wife. Now this is these are those of the household of faith, these Israelite foreigners returning. This is why in his epistles he's constantly going. It may sound like he's going back and forth, but what he's doing, he's teaching two mindsets at the same time. Because when you're reading the letters, you have to put yourself back in that time frame. If you were a Jew in this congregation and you knew the law and the prophets, you understood the things that he was saying, as far as when he brings up the Genesis, the law, things like the prophets. And if you're an Israelite foreigner, a Gentile coming back into the fold, and you're reading these epistles, you're being built up through the things that he is teaching, and also you're questioning the things that you read in the epistles. And I'm speaking in a mindset as one who would read these back then, who was living in that time. And you read and you understand that a promise was given to Abraham, your forefather, and then he showed his works through his faith, but he believed first. So you see how he was building up these two groups, and his directions and instructions to these congregations was to do good to all Jews and Gentiles, but especially to those who are of the faith, as they were returning back into the fold. Verse 11. Ye see how large a letter I have written unto you with mine own hand. Verse 12. As many as desire to make a fair shew in the flesh, they constrain you to be circumcised, only lest they should suffer persecution for the cross of Hamashiach. So now Paul is speaking on these proselytizers who were attempting to convert these Israelite foreigners, and commanded them to circumcise themselves and immediately keep the law, and which meaning immediately keep the works of the law which were not profitable, which was like washing of the cups, offering up sacrifices, going to the feast days. But if you weren't built up in the correct manner, you were the same as these Jews in the ruling positions who were claiming to be righteous, but were doing contrary to what the law commanded as a whole, and they were denying the spiritual aspects, which was loving your own people and not holding a grudge against your people, building them up. Verse 13. For neither they themselves who are circumcised keep the law, but desire to have you circumcised, that they may glory in your flesh. Now let's go to Galatians Chapter 5 and verse 1. And it reads, stand fast, therefore, in the liberty wherewith Hamashiach had made us free, and be not entangled again with the yoke of bondage. Verse 2, behold, I Paul say unto you, that if you be circumcised, Hamashiach shall profit you nothing. So again, the point here Paul is saying is that, circumcision was a Salakia, the law was to be preceded after circumcision. But if you were immediately keeping the law, which you were jumping up, you were skipping to just keeping the law, which is we know as a whole the law is Genesis through the first 5 books. Be Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Deuteronomy, Numbers. But the point is that these proselytizers that were attempting to convert these Israelite foreigners, they were immediately having them jump to the fact that they had to circumcise themselves and then just keep the law, and that was it, when they weren't properly building them up on the things that came before that, and how it all goes hand in hand, and even the prophets. So they were just giving them a small piece, and that was that yoke of bondage. Because again, this is the same thing that these the rulers of the Jews were perpetrating, which was hypocrisy. Now, if you go to verse 14, for all the law is fulfilled in one word, even in this, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. So these this is how they were going off, these the rulers of the Jews, because the law was fulfilled in one word, which is ultimately unification of your own people, and loving your neighbor, which means building them up. Verse 19, now the works of the flesh are manifest, which are these: adultery, fornication, uncleanliness, lasciviousness, idolatry, witchcraft, hatred, variance, emulations, wrath, strife, seditions, heresies. Now that all goes into things that promote division. And the law does not command division. The law commands you to love your own people, reprove them, build them up. And it even says in the law that you're supposed to have equal weights and balances. But this is how you know that the rulers of the Jews, of the multitudes during that time, were not observing the spiritual things, aspects of the law. And these are fruits of the Spirit that Paul speaks on: love, joy, peace, long suffering, gentleness, goodness, and faith. It's Galatians chapter 6 and verse 14. And it reads, but God forbid that I shall glory save in the cross of our Lord Yahushua HaMashiach, by whom the world is crucified unto me, and I unto the world. Verse 15. For in Hamashiach Yahushua neither circumcision availeth anything, nor uncircumcision, but a new creature. Paul's not teaching contrary to the law. What he's saying is that if you're circumcised, then you know you have to keep the law. If you know you have to keep the law, you know you have to keep the things, the principles of the law, which is loving your own people. So that's not important, the circumcision or uncircumcision, which the uncircumcision were those who were just coming back into the fold. So it didn't matter if you were uncircumcised at the time, you still have to get circumcised, but you have to be built up correctly before doing that. And if you can, you should do it. If you're convicted to do it, then you should. That's a commandment. But the point here is that these Israelite foreigners that were coming back into the fold, Paul is saying that they need to be built up first into the correct understanding, and to become a new creature in its due time. This is Galatians Chapter 5 and verse 18. But if ye be led of the Spirit, you are not under the law. Because if you're led of the Spirit, you know, you're led to the things that the principles that the law teaches. And Paul is not saying you're not under the law, like literally you're not to follow the law. But it says you have to understand the principles of the law. It's Galatians chapter 4 and verse 21. Tell me, ye that desire to be under the law, do ye not hear the law? And this is why he said in Galatians 5:1 that be not entangled again with the yoke of bondage, because these rulers of the Jews, of the multitudes, they desired to be under the law, but they did not hear the law. They did not hear the points of the law that taught you not to hold a grudge against your own people, and to honor your father and your mother. So they weren't hearing the law, because they had that the Corban tradition, to neglect if you had an offering, sacrifice, because you were commanded to do a sacrifice at the temple, and that you had that overrode the fact that you couldn't help your parents if you had a sacrifice already, that it was already consecrated to be offered up at the temple. So that's why it says, tell me, ye that desire to be under the law, do ye not hear the law? There was many of those proselytizers who were attempting to convert these Israelite foreigners. They did not hear the law, but they just desired to be under the law, because that's what they were taught through the hypocrisy of the rulers of the Jews. It's Galatians chapter 5 and verse 22. And it reads, but the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, long-suffering, gentleness, goodness, faith, meekness, temperance. Against such there is no law. So all these things aren't literally, the law doesn't tell you to have love, joy, peace, long-suffering, or any of these things that I just read, but that's the spirit that the law comes in. Because when you're loving your own people, you're showing that love, and you're promoting peace and not division. This is how you know that you're walking in the Spirit, when you're doing these things according to its measure and its time. Verse 24, and they that are Hamashiachs have crucified the flesh with the affections and lusts. So crucifying the flesh, the works of the flesh, are what? Those things that I read in chapter 5 and with verse 19. These are the things that the law commands you not to do. Verse 25, if we live in the Spirit, let us also walk in the Spirit. So if you're living in the spirit of what the law comes in, which is the spirit of righteousness and truth, you're doing the things that pertain to that. In your faith, meaning in your inward man, and showing it through your works, through your conduct. You're executing it with your right hand. Verse actually that was it for that. Now let's go to Galatians chapter 6 and verse 16. And as many as walk according to this rule, peace be on them and mercy and upon the Israel of God. So the point here, and the reason why Paul said Israel of God, is he's uniting these Jews and these Gentiles, these Israelite foreigners, those who had left their former covenants and are now returning back into the fold. And he's saying peace upon the nation of Israel. Because he's establishing the fact, like he established it in chapter 3, that the promises were given to Abraham first. And he believed the promises, then showed his faith through the execution of his works by doing the things that the Most High commanded, leaving the land of his people, doing the things that was commanded after that. Command as far as when he had offered up almost offered up Isaac, his only son. And the Most High found him faithful and gave him the covenant of circumcision. And ultimately, and he gave him the promises. And that was given through a dispensation of time and inherited by the children of Israel, the circumcision and the promises. So Paul is saying, if you go back, this is how you're built up. When you're going back to these things and put them all together through the dispensation of its time, and you gather that understand it how it was written for that time, because through the dispensation of time, the nation of Israel inherited the promises and the covenant of circumcision. And ultimately the law, which was for a unification and also for the government of the children of Israel as a whole, for to be that schoolmaster. And then through this dispensation of the time of the Romans and the Greeks was to unify these two groups. This is why Paul says the Israel of God. And that pertains to the same people of the nation of Israel. That doesn't go into a spiritual Israel like many think. Because Paul is telling you throughout the epistles what is walking in the Spirit. Which are things, these are all things that are contained in the law. And who is under the law? The Israelites, so-called Black, Hispanic, Native Americans. Now let's go to 2 Corinthians chapter 5 and verse 17. And it reads, therefore, if any man be in Hamashiach, he is a new creature. Old things are passed away, behold, all things are become new. Verse 18. And all things are of God, who hath reconciled to us to himself by Yahushua Mashiach. Because ultimately through the law, if you know the law, you know in Deuteronomy, Yahushua Mashiach was going to come on the scene during the time of the unification of these two groups. This is why it says in the law you will obey his voice. And hath given to us the ministry of reconciliation. Verse 19, to wit, that God was in Hamashiach, reconciling the world unto himself, not imputing their trespasses unto them, and hath committed unto us the word of reconciliation. Now this was that reconciliation that ultimately the prophet that was supposed to be raised up among the children of Israel, that they were to hearken unto and follow his commands. And the commands were to show the proper execution of the law, and for him to be a propitiation for sins, and the trespasses to be to ultimately disannul the things that would keep you away from your own people. If you transgress things like not showing up for the feast days, eating blood on accident, or whatever the case may have been, or if you had things of that sort. Now, let's go to the book of Galatians, chapter 2, and Galatians chapter 2 and verse 14. Blotting out the handwriting of ordinances that was against us, which was contrary to us, and took it out of the way, nailing it to his cross. Verse 15, and having spoiled principalities and powers, he made a show of them openly, triumphing over them in it. So now Yahushua Mashiach was to blot out those ordinances and things that we weren't justified in when we had left the covenants. And we're justified in that belief. And our belief is justified in the fact that the promises were given to our forefather Abraham through the lineage of Isaac and our father Jacob. That's all done through the power of Spirit Yahweh Bashim Yahushai. That's that covering. That's that propitiation for sin. To Yahushai HaMashiach. Let's go back to book of Galatians, chapter 6 and verse 17. And it reads, from henceforth let no man trouble me, for I bear in my body the marks of the Lord Yahushai. Verse 18. Brethren, the grace of our Lord Yahushua Mashiach be with your spirit. Amen. Unto the Galatians, written from Rome. Now, let me see if I can get a last precept. Salaki, bear with me. book of Matthew chapter 12 and verse 24. And it reads, actually, that's not the right one. It's book of Mark chapter 12 and verse 24. And it reads, And Yahushua answering said unto them, Do ye not therefore err, because ye know not the scriptures, neither the power of Yahweh. Verse and as touching the dead, verse 26. Or I'll start at verse 25. For when they shall rise from the dead, they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are as the angels which are in heaven. Verse 26. And as touching the dead, they that rise have ye not read in the book of Moses, how in the bush God spake unto him, saying, I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. Verse 27. He is not the God of the dead, but the God of the living. Ye therefore do greatly err. So the point here being is that the Most High said he is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and this is through the mouth of the prophet himself, Yahushua Mashiach, and he was rebuking ultimately the leaders of the people, telling them that they greatly err because they don't understand the scriptures, neither the power that the Most High has, as far as the things that were prophesied to come to pass. This is Galatians Chapter 6 breakdown. Hear, O Israel, giving all honor and glory to Yahweh B'Shem Yahushai. Say Shalom.